how did the celebrated medieval European longsword come to be? Did it follow the same design principle over time, or did it evolve to suit diverse needs of medieval fighting on both the battlefield, but also in the courtyard of judicial duels? Greetings, sword friends. Today, allow me to invite you on a journey back 700 years into the past through the time machine in my hand to look at the evolution of the world-famous medieval European longswords. I have been wanting to make this video since the early days of my sword review career, and finally, we have the unique opportunity of looking at every single subtype of the Oakeshott typology, since I've collected at least one excellent specimen, or very accurate reproduction of medieval originals for each subtype. There have been other content creators talking about the evolution of medieval longswords in the past. Now, I have some problems with their approach that usually they don't go over every subtype variation of medieval longswords. They just present a few very stereotypical examples. Sometimes they don't use authentic reproductions to represent each subtype when they talk about the traits and characteristics of these subtypes. That really presents a problem, as if one uses poorly made replicas to talk about the traits of original medieval swords, you might reach the complete wrong conclusions as how they will handle and the primary purposes of these medieval original swords. What often leaves me less impressed is how the commentators ignore the incredible variety of longswords and their evolutions throughout the span of several centuries, and talk about their handling traits and functions as if they were this singular, uniform, and monotonous entity. So really, I spent the time and effort over the years to collect very authentic reproductions designed by sword makers that visit museums to examine surviving examples in a very meticulous way, documenting their handling characteristics, visual elements, but also the very detailed and careful measurements. And each one of these has been verified by historians, collectors, but also historical European martial art practitioners in competition cutting, review, and examinations as being accurate representations of the originals. Obviously, the ideal scenario will always be you use antique originals of excellent condition to represent each subtype, but let's face it, collecting 600-700-year-old antiques still in one piece is a very tall order, and I doubt even Oakeshott himself collected specimens for each subtype. So we'll have to do this through the lens of modern reproduction, but authentic ones. Now, let's first take a look at the definition of longswords. Longswords have been the darling of weapon-based martial arts representation in modern pop culture. They are often depicted to be used by people from time periods that European longswords didn't even exist in. They symbolize nobility, knightly virtues, authority, elegance, and later sword fighting skills. Now, you might or might not be surprised to hear that in Europe, longswords came to be in the late 13th century. Now, first, we have to give a very clear definition of what a longsword is. Obviously, some mistake a longsword as being long overall, and that's just not what we mean in modern HEMA context. Now, in German fencing traditions, longswording just means holding onto the sword with both of your hands on the grip. In contrast, half-swording means holding onto the blade, usually with an armored gauntlet, with your offhand, and still holding onto the grip with your main hand. And this increases the precision of your jabbing and leverage in armored fighting, grappling. Whereas holding onto the grip with both hands, you gain enhanced reach and striking power, thanks to increased tip speed due to the lengthened lever at the point of impact, with the target further away from the axis of rotation. And that greater velocity translates into greater kinetic energy and momentum. Now, in history, there have been longer bladed swords prior to the appearance of longswords. Now, this is one of my favorite comparisons to make. Over here, Oakeshott Type 11 arming sword of single-handed usage with a 37-inch long blade. As you can see here, the blade itself is no shorter than any longsword. Really, in many cases, it's actually quite a bit longer, especially some of the specimens here. But as you can see, the grip is decidedly designed for single-handed usage. There is practically no way for you to hold on to this sword in both hands, especially with this Brazil nut pommel. And that really solidifies the usage of these swords in one hand, particularly this one here, used from horseback as a cavalry sword. We can hardly call this a long sword, even though it has a very long blade. Conversely, if we look at the blade on this Albion Viceroy here, the blade is almost as long as this Type 11 arming sword, yet the hilt can decidedly accommodate both hands on the hilt. Not only has a very long grip with the leather wrapping, but also this official pommel has a stock facilitating the lengthening of the grippable space over here. So between the main hand and the offhand, there is still some generous space. Therefore, when you rotate the sword, the palm of your main hand does not collide with the thumb of your offhand. Now, in the beginning, this wasn't really the case. As we examine this Albion Baron here of Oakeshott Type 12, you can see here, there's barely enough space for you to space out your two hands. So that infers some difference in the usage. However, we can clearly see here, this sword is designed to have both hands on the grip. And really, all of these swords that can be called long swords have the traits, right? You know, the weight, balance, and mass distribution that make the sword being able to use in one hand. Even this heavy example of earlier Great Sword of War, you can see here, you can still swing it from horseback, or when your offhand is holding onto a shield, or when you're grappling against your opponent, you can still use one hand to jab or do some cutting motion. Obviously, they are optimized to be used in two hands. When you add an additional hand on the grip, instantly, you sacrifice a little bit of your reach. You can see here, the reach is less than what I can reach forward with one of my hands on the grip. So with this, I also gain the benefit of increased leverage for you to pull off some maneuvers with ease, do acceleration much more easily. Also, when you cut down onto a target, should you meet any resistance, you have stability with both hands on the grip. So your blade will not easily turn, get deflected on your opponent's armor, or if you cleave into their bones, you will still have the stability to maintain the edge alignment. Obviously, having both hands on the grip has so many benefits. Why didn't sword makers come up with this earlier? We do know that medieval swords evolved from Roman gladius and later longer-bladed spasa. That's very ubiquitous throughout Europe. And these evolved from earlier Bronze Age swords. There have been some longer-bladed ones, but we can see they were only used in one hand because you really need the protection of the shield. So you cannot afford having two hands on the grip. Therefore, nobody even bothered making swords with long grips. That's really tied to the technology of armor making. And really, one facilitates the evolution of the other one. So essentially, the evolution of swords reflects the advancement of armor making, how protected the combatants felt when they are encased in armor. Now, what happened in the 13th century is that there was a transition between using mail armor exclusively to combining mail and more rigid plate armor. In the beginning, there were only coat plates for wealthy knights. So essentially, it's circled, lined with steel plates on the inside. It protects the torso, but also the upper lower body And then, as time went on, plated components have been added to limbs. So you have Pauline and the Couture for the knee and the elbows. Obviously, these are very critical points of your body. The joints, once injured, pretty much cripples that limb. So you want them to be well protected. And then there are articulated plates to protect arms and legs, cuisses and greaves for upper and lower legs, rear braces and vent braces for upper and forearms, heavily articulated gauntlets and sabaton to cover the hands and feet. Eventually, there are cuirass made of 1 or 2 solid pieces of steel. First, the chest, that's a breastplate, but also the backplate. 2 components joined together as the cuirass to protect the torso of the wearer. And then, in the 14th and 15th century, armorsmiths invented thoughts to drape from the lower end of the cuirass and distributed the weight of this entire upper body armor on both the shoulder and the waist. And eventually there are armored spotters on the shoulder, but later bigger pauldrons for cavalry actions or jousting purposes. So when you have knights increasingly protected, there was a sort of an elitist take when it comes to combating lower ranked troops in massive numbers. Let's face it, on the battlefield, when you're protected with coat of plates, but also limb armor, and let's not forget, the gaps are still protected by mail armor, which is phenomenal against cuts and some light jabs. When you see some peasant levies, essentially unarmored troops en masse, you very much feel like an invulnerable superhero. And what do humans tend to do when they feel safe and protected? They make their weapons bigger. So if you look at this earlier longsword, what we call the Great Sword of War, not to be confused with a great sword, it's just a greater sword of war. As you can see here, this Type 12 arming sword here, the Albion Knight, is a very typical single-handed sidearm for 12th and 13th century men-at-arms. And when they are well protected, what they did was scaling up not just the blade, as you can see here, Type 12, Type 12A, essentially this Albion Baron here just scale up the Albion Knight's blade to make it a little bit broader, but much longer, and a little bit heavier, but also having a much longer grip to accommodate both hands on the hilt. So now you don't have to worry too much about defense, as you're protected from head to toe in a great helm and coat of plates, limb armor. Essentially, you're not vulnerable against peasant levies with spears or such. Now, adding another hand on a sword that's heavier and much deadlier than before has a lot of advantage. First thing is the psychological warfare, and being able to zip someone in half cleanly has an effect on your enemy combatants. Even when you don't have to defeat them all, you don't have to slay them all, their morale will soon deplete and they will break rank. Essentially the best kind of victory. This reflects a degree of asymmetric warfare. And we will be able to see these longer bladed, longer hilted, earlier longswords or great sword of war handle with intent. They are purpose-built for asymmetric warfare, primarily cutting, as cutting has a best kind of stopping power. If you jab into someone's body, yeah, eventually they will collapse, but not before they fight you for another 30 to 60 seconds. And if you have multiple assailants, you'll be really in trouble. However, if you basically cut someone in half, the other attackers will probably be dissuaded. And by the end of the 13th century, around 1290 or so, we see the philosophy of the Great Sword of War being on a steroid. This one over here, the Oakeshott Type 13A Great Sword of War. Here, you can see it just take the concept of Type 12A, but make it even broader. There's less profile taper, meaning the blade doesn't really narrow down that much. Essentially, it's like a razor on a very long hilt for you to use in two hands. You can see here, obviously, this kind of blade silhouette sacrifices the pointiness of the tip because it's still so wide near the tip. So it terminates not into a pointy tip, but rather spatulate, rounded tip. And while this might not be a good thrusting sword, it's still possible to go through protective gambison into the flesh and still be fatal with a jab like this. But really, you have to think about it. The purpose of this kind of tip is the roundedness, the sudden transition to this point, very short arc, is that it has a curved edge near the tip. If you do a tip cut, that is calculating the distance, and cut into the surface of the opponent's body, on that tip, you obviously decrease the contact surface. There is a much greater chance for you to go through toughened gambison because, let's face it, nobody is willing to throw their lives away. And in the 13th century, there's some development of affordable armor that is textile protection. Dozens of layers of hardened linen and cotton, resulting in very cut-resistant material for lower-ranked troops, peasant levies, but also as the base for the arming doublet, arming shows for armored knights. The great swords of war were developed as a mandate to enhance the cutting power in order to defeat gambison, which would usually suffice, warding against cuts by the standard one-handed swords of the time. Of course, many people without the experience handling these authentic great sword of war will assume that they handle in a similar way as the later true longswords, and that couldn't be further from the truth. If I pick up a very balanced 15th century cut and strike longsword here, this one here, the Albion Regent, you can feel how different they are in the rotation. As you can see, this one here requires much more effort in the rotation. If you want to do a short wrist power cut, this Albion Regent here is much easier to execute. It requires much less force for you to accelerate within a short distance. And this is still not the most lively longsword, of course. It's a very middle-of-the-road cut and thrust type. So the nimbleness of the tip is not a primary concern, even though it is not bad at all. So in the earlier years of longswords, late 13th century and early 14th century, people wielding these big great swords of war did not bother with techniques too much. Essentially, these are just big cleaving implements for you to dominate the battlefield and show off your superiority. As I mentioned earlier, the evolution of swords pretty much reflects the advancement of armor making. In the late 14th century, coats of plates became replaced increasingly by full plate cuirass, but also more protected plate armor. Another development is that plate armor became more prominent. So not only the knightly class could afford them, but also some men-at-arms essentially were equipped on the same level as knights. Armored combatants had a greater chance of encountering opponents equipped at the same level of protection as themselves. It goes without saying that using a cutting-focused sword like this does not have a lot of advantage over other armored people well protected by steel. Let's face it, this is a very fearsome cutting implement, but there's no way for you to cut through plates. And let's be honest, this is nowhere as nimble as the later longswords. The need for sword agility is to complement the development of sword fighting. As you can see here, you really are not supposed to do a lot of very complex technique with this kind of sword because of the limited rotation. Of course, even without much profile taper at all, there is still a very significant amount of distal taper, meaning that the blade has a thickness up here And these kind of blades are rather thin because they have a lenticular cross-section without a prominent central ridge. And still, they are usually between 5 and 6 millimeters at the base. They evenly thins down throughout the length of the blade and becomes very thin over here. And you can see it has a certain flexibility to absorb the shock should there be an impact against opponent's weapon or when you cleave into a target. But also a very thin blade. You can see a white one is a very proficient one for cutting, especially when you have this very smooth lenticular cross-section on both the Oakeshott Type 12A and 13A blades. Okay, these are the traits of earlier medieval swords, and having lenticular cross-section without a central ridge, very thin and smooth grind, essentially a convex grind on both edges. They facilitate very smooth cutting. It reduces the resistance as the edge angle is very small. However, there is just no chance for you to use these thin-bladed big swords to cut through steel armor. And let's face it, without cutting through it, there isn't much impact at all by using these comparing to percussive weapons like mace and warhammers. So if you want to damage armor components without breaking their plate armor, you really have to consider those warhammers and maces rather than these bladed weapons. Now, there are other ways to defeat armored knight, even by using swords, and that is what we'll see in the evolution of longswords. If we put these great swords of war down, you can see this Oakeshott Type 16A longsword over here. We compare just the profile of the 16A against this Type 12A. This one happens to be made by Angus trim. You can see here, there's quite a bit of change. And this 16A came in mid-14th century, by the way, so essentially 3/4 of a century later than these 12A swords. You can see here, there has been increased profile taper, meaning the blade goes gradually down in width, become narrower and narrower as it approaches the tip, compared to the 12A, not to even mention Type 13A here. You can see such a contrast, right? So you can guess that this kind of tip will have much less of a challenge going through Gambison, and there is even a chance for this tip to go through larger mail rings, but still not very likely. What this does is that it changes the mass distribution of the blade. When we talk about a sword, it's really the mass distribution that dictates the handling characteristics, not just the weight and the balance, okay? When we talk about how superior the balance of a sword is, in itself, the balance is really not that important. We're not talking about a barbell here, right? Of course, the balance matters, but it's really the mass distribution. So having a more pronounced profile taper means that there is less steel on the upper portion of the blade comparing to the base. So this Type 16A longsword still has a very pronounced distal taper, meaning that the thickness also thins down very evenly as it approaches the tip. And combined with the increased profile taper, now you can see here, it's a much nimbler sword comparing to the earlier Type 12A. See the rate of rotation here as you accelerate the blade. It takes much more force, much longer distance for you to fully accelerate the blade. Makes sense because on the upper portion it has more mass. Even when it still carries a very large degree of distal taper, do not underestimate how much thinner the blade is over here comparing to the base. This one over here has lost 2/3 of the thickness in this plane. Yet still, right, the responsiveness basically cannot compare to Type 16A. So what this does is that not only is it easier to accelerate the blade, but also it's much easier to get the point to where you want it to be. So it's really not hard to imagine that use this type of longsword to do precise jabbing into any gap is much more efficient than those earlier swords of war. It's also noteworthy that Type 16A longswords has a broad spectrum, all the way from transitional swords sharing lots of traits with Type 12A, having broad and thin cutting-oriented blades, to beefy war longswords, such as this longsword inspired by the Brescia Museum example commissioned by Brother Nathaniel and made by Master Perna as his last custom piece before his tragic passing, all the way to these nimble dueling swords made by Angus trim that weighs little more than 2.5 pounds. Yet one thing they share in common is that it doesn't matter the profile and mass distribution, they all still very much emphasize the fearsome cutting potential. Perhaps not the most proficient cutting swords, yet still very respectable in the cutting capacity. Now, as armor further evolved by the late 14th century, there was far less competence in terms of number on the battlefield. Yet they became much better trained, much better equipped, and much better organized. There's a much smaller yet well-maintained corps of men-at-arms on the battlefield, and most of the time they were used to counter your opponent's regiment of men-at-arms in full armor, and this is usually seen in wars like the 100 Years' War, at the Battle of Crécy, the Battle of Agincourt. To defeat these fully armored knights, you have to really fatigue them, and then you exploit the weakness of their armor, because killing them will be very inefficient. It requires a lot of effort, but also risky. Now, if you can exploit the weakness of their armor, you can wound or kill a number of them, but then you can also take a great number of them as hostage, so you can get very handsome ransom from their families. So swords further evolved in this period to combat the development of armor making. We can see here, by the end of the 14th century, the typology of the longswords pretty much took a 180-degree turn that went the other direction as these earlier great swords of war, as you can see here. Now, if you just look at this Oakeshott Type 15A longsword here, you might think it's a very narrow sword, but it might shock you that if you compare it to the earlier XIIIa, you can see at the base, the width is actually similar, but there is so much more profile taper, meaning that it becomes aggressively narrowed on the upper portion of the blade, but it's still, like, through the entire blade's length is a very even rate of narrowing down. But also, this takes on a full diamond cross-section in the blade with a very prominent central ridge, and there's a flat facet surface from the central ridge to the edge. What this does is that it increases the thickness dramatically. If you look at these two swords, this is almost twice as thick, and especially on the upper portion, even though this still has a very good amount of distal taper. Near here is about half the thickness as the base. But if you compare it to this Great Sword of War here, you can see this one is about 2 to 3 times as thick, even though it's much narrower. So whereas these Great Sword of War are pretty flexible, being thin, cutting-oriented swords, you can look at a Type 15A longsword here, the Albion Ringeck. You can see here, there's virtually no flexibility at all. Of course, if you flex the entire blade, see, mark on the hilt here, you can see it's still made of spring steel, so it's quite durable. Yet, it doesn't take a lot to figure out this type of thick, narrow, rigid blade is for you to jab into your opponent's armor's gap. Right? As the gap becomes smaller and smaller, you really need narrower swords but also thick ones to be durable, bust into the gap, the articulation of the plates. You don't want your swords to be very thin, like the edges on earlier Great Swords of War, so they will be damaged when you do that. And it also has very narrow blade for you to do hot sorting stances, do these precise jabbing. But also, in armor fighting, you can use the sword as some kind of grappling leverage to gain advantage against your opponent, maybe trip them, and use the hilt, but also each part of the blade to hook your opponent in armored grappling fighting. And you can see, not only that it has very thick and narrow blades to do this kind of task, but also having such dramatic degree of profile taper in conjunction with distal taper, meaning that on the upper portion, it actually carries a lot less steel material comparing to the base. And this rate is very gradual, right? From a large base, it tapers down in both dimensions. So what this does is that it results in a blade that's extremely nimble because there's so much less material over here comparing to the base. So you see here how effortless it is to rotate a blade like this. Acceleration is really easy. So it doesn't matter which guard position you start from, very precise jabbing can be launched easily. It also makes cutting a little bit easier, but it doesn't take a lot to figure out that these swords are not primarily used as cutting swords. Sure, they have edges, it's easier to accelerate them. As you can see here, this is a shorter variant of the Type 15A longsword, Lockwood hand-and-a-half sword over here. You can see this blade has a 33-inch long blade, very similar to the Albion Mercenary, but has a different style of pommel, squashed. So with this degree of profile taper, they're all very fast sword to accelerate, yet carrying so much less material on the upper portion, usually called the foible of fencing. Here, comparing to the base, means that they are not the most proficient cutting swords.
Here is another fine example of the shorter and broader variant of Type 15A, the Albion Castellan, which is based on some of the hand-and-a-half swords in the Castellan Horde Group D. This is my Castellan being reviewed by Andy of Dalatrax Swords. And you can see the typical fishtail pommel and the clubbed crossguard and the very short grip. It has a more acute needle tip, which is more stereotypical for the type than the Lockwood hand-and-a-half. When you turn the blade to the side, you can see there is a noticeable swollen, reinforced tip, which shows that this type of sword is expected to jab into the gaps of plate armor. That's covered by riveted mail, which is still protective, but can be exploited by the most narrow and robust sword tips.
If you use these to cut against someone in heavy gambeson, it's unlikely they will slice through all layers of gambeson because these are so narrow yet thick. So the edge bevel results in very large edge angles. They just encounter so much more resistance in cutting comparing to these earlier Great Swords of War. So on the spectrum from cut-centric to thrust-centric, we basically just traveled from one extreme to the other within the span of 100 years, as you can see here. Right? Beginning of the 14th century, the end of the 14th century. It's also very interesting that this Type 16A longsword actually came earlier than Type 15A. So this just tells you that there are some oddities in the Oakeshott typology. Now, being an antiquarian himself and a collector, seasoned fencer as well, Oakeshott knows swords in and out, especially antique originals. But when he compiled the typology, shall we say, there's sometimes just some oversize, and the number system of this is just it's very peculiar where type 16 comes before type 15. And this goes the same for single-handed armor sword as well. So do not confuse type 16A as being later than the type 15A, and they are actually earlier. And we go down the typology. The next one after type 15A is actually type 17. And these swords also came around the late 14th century and early 15th century. As you can see here, they are very similar swords as the type 15A. They're not very broad at the base. There's certain broadness, and they taper down dramatically. Even though you can see here, the profile taper is not as pronounced as the type 15A. So most of the time, they come a little bit narrower at the base, and on the upper portion, they don't become as narrow. So the degree of profile taper is less than 15A. Another very prominent defining feature of type 17 longswords is their cross-section. These are found in groups, usually in sempak, but also like other English longswords having this type of blade. They always have a hexagonal cross-section, meaning they are six-sided in the cross-section, especially in the lower half of the blade. And there are some variations. Your Oakeshott described one of the type 17 longsword that he handled being lightweight but very lively, and he probably describes this particular example, which is a specimen housed at Royal Armouries in Leeds. Comes just around 3 pounds, which is quite a bit lighter than all the specimen that came before, but also with a very prominent profile taper and distal taper, it's fairly lively. It's not as handy and as fast or precise as type 15A longswords, but the hexagonal cross-section at the base makes it carry additional amount of steel at the base. So this brings some more material back to the base, making the sword overall just more maneuverable, and the tip quite nimble as well, even though it doesn't sacrifice as much cutting ability as the type 15A. And you can see still this has more thrust in mind than cut. And I have test cut with this Royal Armouries collection longsword developed by Matt Easton by arranging private sessions with the museum for him to closely examine the details of the originals and take precise measurements and close-up photos of the geometries of different components of the swords. This example here is quite unique as it features a ricasso at the base. It's not really a true ricasso, it's a beveled area, but it doesn't terminate into a sharpened edge. It's a very blunt edge, almost like a ricasso. Not as thick as later longswords, as you will see on the Albion Viceroy here, type 20A, very thick ricasso here. These are not those at the base of the blade, just blunted area, and then it transitions into a beveled hexagonal cross-section. When I test cut with this type 17 longsword, I found it to be not very proficient at cutting. It's serviceable, but being able to launch these very fast cuts with relatively small effort. Still, the very prominent diamond cross-section on the upper portion makes the edge angle very, very large. So as you cleave into organic material, as you can see here, cut into pumpkin, it just meets so much resistance. And soon it basically loses all the momentum and gets stuck in the target. So we can see here, these type 15A, type 17 longswords primarily were used as thrusting swords against armored opponents, but they have some cutting capacity in an armored combat against civilian, so you can use them in an armored duels against a willing opponent, especially these 15A longswords. They are very prevalent in period longsword fencing treatises and illustration. You see for Taffer, for Fiore di Libri, they all have this kind of blade in their fencing treatises and this illustration. So with a blade this lively, with rate of rotation this much, it has a very large polar movement, meaning that you can easily get the tip to reach a destination with minimal effort, very little force, but also very little time to accelerate. So as you can see here, to pull off these very complex technique, it's really effortless. It's pretty much, just ideal swords for these prescribed techniques in these longsword fencing treatises. So essentially, a pinnacle that symbolize the technique and skill facets of sword fighting in Europe at the time. But also these shorter, you can call them bastard swords or hand-and-a-half swords. They're basically just a hybrid between one-handed swords and two-handed ones. You can use them as a long sword with just a little bit decreased reach, but you can easily use them in one hand as well. So this serves really well as a riding sword on the hip of a knight, or for anyone like a mercenary that needs to operate other larger weapons like bills, halberds, longbows, crossbows. So this will be very handy because the hilt is not very long, not as long as these long swords, so they don't come into interference with your operation on the battlefield. Now, as we further progress in history, we see a turn from the extreme of thrust-oriented sword back into somewhere that's an equilibrium between cut focus and thrust focus, the cut and thrust swords. So basically, kind of a callback to earlier type 16A longswords. So here, it's a compromise design between cut and thrust. And if we compare the Oakeshott type 18A longsword or hand-and-a-half sword profile against the 16A, you can see, yeah, there's some difference in the width of the blade, but the degree of profile taper is very similar. So we can see this is indeed an attempt to balance thrust and cut. You can see here this type 18 blade comparing to type 15A, it has less dramatic profile taper. So it's not a triangular shape on the blade. It has a very gentle curve, rate of profile taper on the blade. So on the upper portion, that's compared to a more comparable type 50A, shorter ones, you can see here. On the upper portion, this one here is much broader than this one. So having a broader blade, that's also a little bit thinner than this one with less pronounced central ridge. It has enhanced cutting potential over this one, the type 15A. But it compromises a little bit of the thrusting potential, because if you see the transition to the tip here, it's acute, but it's nowhere as narrow as these type 15A. So there's very little chance for you to jab into the mail armor and bust a ring. Essentially, these are only used with thrusting against opponents out of steel armor. And you can still exploit, the gap of the plate armor should the wearer forego mail armor to cover up the gaps.
Perhaps you would question why anyone would forego the mail protection under the plate, such as the mail voiders under the pauldron or spouters to cover the armpits, and the mail sender to cover the throat. Well, you have to consider that adding any additional weight or material in these area. Why are they exposed in the first place? Because you want to increase the range of motion, right? The mobility. You don't want to stuff full of steel in these areas. You will lose a lot of range of motion if you do that. So there are some knights that forego these areas because you have to understand that when you fight someone in full plate armor,
they are very dangerous. They are well protected, even though they have vulnerabilities. They are also fighting back. They are trying to kill you as well. So don't think that it's easy to exploit these weaknesses. But it's possible, if they don't wear mail armor with a tip like this, go into the gap and penetrate the arming doublet between the armor, and this will go into the armpit and do some major damage with this one. Of course, it might not go in as deep, but it will open up the wounds a little bit more comparing to these blades with needle points. So very balanced cotton strut swords. This one here is made by Angus trim. It's one of my favorite hand-and-a-half swords. Just the mass is so scientifically distributed along the entire blade. It's the best compromise between agility and rigidity, cutting potential. It's super fast, yet still has a lot of authority at the point of percussion. You feel the weight of every inch of this blade, and still it's really easy to use in both one hand and two. So Oakeshott Type 18A swords are the pinnacle of hand-and-a-half bastard swords. And you can see the silhouette here, the rate of profile taper. If I pick up this Albion Regent here, you can see, yeah, there's a lot of difference between these two's widths, but the strategy of narrowing down the profile taper is quite similar on these two. So clearly this Type 18B longsword, the Albion Regent, is also another example of the cotton strut compromise design. Fairly acute point to jab. This one is narrower than this one because it started out narrower and thicker. Obviously, this one's silhouette means that it's not as proficient at cutting as this one over here, but it does has an advantage. This is the cross section. As these later medieval swords all have a central ridge forming a diamond cross section, this one here is not a perfect diamonds over here. You can see here it forms a diamond but with a certain degree of scalloping. It's a hollow ground blade. So from the central ridge to the edge, it's a concave grind. It reduces a certain amount of steel from the blade, lightening the blade across the entire length, but also it reduces the edge angle because it becomes thinner near the edge than a flat grind diamond cross section. So this is my first Albion longsword. Still, it remains my favorite longsword. Just a perfect blend between cut and strut, all the techniques you can pull off with this one, and it's very fast yet still very authoritative. Coming in at 3.4 pounds, just a very middling, very average weight for a very average longsword. Blade length 37 inch. Overall is 40, approaching 48 inch in overall length. And you can see here, it also has facial pommel. Okay, if we look at many earlier examples of swords, they have this very iconic wheel pommel by the end, and you have to question why, as many modern users are not big fan of these wheel pommels, because if you hold the sword in a hammer grip, you rotate the sword, the wheel pommel digs into the base of your palm. It's not very comfortable, limited range of motion. But if you allow the wheel pommel to rest on the side of your palm, whether it's offhand or in single hands case, rests on the palm, side of your palm of the main hand, you can see it rotates fairly well. But you cannot partially grip onto a wheel pommel because it doesn't fit. The whole point of the wheel pommel is that when you draw the sword from the scabbard, right, in a pinch, it doesn't matter how you grip it, it's really easy to get out the scabbard, and it serves as a great retention, a hand stop. But as it's a hand stop, it's not the most comfortable, most ergonomic design, even though it's definitely the most popular pommel design on all medieval swords. So as we progress in time, we can see here, many of these swords start to use this geometry, right? Essentially a stock, and then flares up So this is what we call a scent stopper type of pommel. There are several different designs. You can see here, they are all slightly different. They have different number of facets. Some are facetless, so essentially like a doorknob, but they are very ergonomic because the stock, doesn't matter how long it is on the pommel, it naturally lengthens the grippable area. So with this kind of pommel, you can naturally space out your two hands. Look at the grip. It's not very long on this one, but you don't have to hold the sword like this. It's very hard to use it. You can just slide downward, grab pretty much 60% of the pommel, so becomes a very long, comfortable grip. And scent stopper pommels comes in very diverse geometries. This is one on the Royal Armouries collection, type 17 longsword here. It's less rounded, but still it's quite comfortable to hold on to. And now we can see by the mid 1400s, right? Mid 15th century, you have complex geometries on type 18 blades, 18B specifically on this one. Also on the crossguard, yes, you can see the octagonal cross-section on the A facets on the crossguards cross-section, but you also see hexagonal cross-section in the grip. So there's an obsession of dimensions in geometries in this period as it approaches the Renaissance. And you can also see here, this pommel has a very complex shape. It's what we call flamboyant fishtail pommel. Fishtail pommels come in a few different variations. You can see here, this Albion Principe here has another simpler type of fishtail pommel. It's more rounded. It's not as flamboyant as the one on the Albion Regent, as you can see here. You also have the most elaborate type of fishtail pommel found on some English and French swords in the Castellan group. You can look at the dimensionality of the pommel on the Albion Castellan. So this is more comfortable to hold down to, while this one over here, the Albion Regent, has just such a striking appearance. There's no wonder that it remains my favorite longsword of all time. It's a perfect blend of visual elements, right? Stunning aesthetic values and functionality, right? It's elegant. It is not overly gaudy. There's no additional hill components on it. Everything is there to ensure the functionality of the sword. The long crossguard to reflect the German fencing techniques. You use the crossguard to reliably catch your opponent's blade. And you also use the flat of the blade to do a lot of wrist twisting techniques, do lots of winding and bind in the bind. So just a perfect blend, the Albion Regent. But then there are quite a few variations of the Oakeshott type 18 blades. You can see here, this one is a type 18C, right? And a blade that emulates the Alexandria Arsenal type 18C blades. Right? They were found in the 20th century, even though they were made back in the early 15th century, and they were gifted or captured and end up in the hands of Mamluk Sultanate, who donated these big bladed swords to the frontier arsenal of Alexandria. They were auctioned in the 20th century to various museums and private collections. These wide-bladed swords, some housed at the Metropolitan Museum or the Museum of Art in Philadelphia, but also Royal Armouries in Leeds. So several museums of arms armor around the world held examples of the Alexandria Arsenal swords. Usually they come with a wheel pommel, but this one is designed by Peter Johnson to incorporate some English longswords, hilt, right? The clubbed straight crossguard with a foliate motif here, and also a plain facial pommel. And as I talked about earlier, facial pommel naturally lengthens the grippable area. So with such a broad, intimidating blade, you have extra leverage now to make it even more maneuverable. If you look at the blade, it's not very long at all. It's 34 inches in blade length, but it's over 3 inches wide, quite a bit wider than 3 inches at the base. It has very gentle profile taper, not really triangular, much less so in the base, but also has a flare shoulder, meaning that it narrows down quite a bit here and it slows down the rate and still tapers down in width gradually, and around the midpoint of the blade it picks up the pace, right, gradually, resulting in this very just imposing, intimidating profile silhouette of a blade. Because over here at the foible where you cut with the most is still very wide. If you compare this to the earlier Great Swords of War, you can see here is shorter, but the width on the upper portion is very comparable. Yet it has much more profile taper, it narrows down a lot comparing to the base. Combined with a healthy degree of distal taper from 5 millimeters down to 2 millimeters near the tip, this is a very nimble blade. Right? It comes in nearly at 4 pounds, so it's very much on par with these much earlier Great Swords of War. And some people like Madison argue that these are essentially in purpose a continuation of the Great Swords of War when they were used by armored knights of Southern Europe against Islamic opponents, right? Essentially Egyptians or Middle Easterners, where many of the troops in the Sultanate did not wear extensive armor because of the hot weather, the climate, but also for other economic reasons. So having a very broad-bladed sword has its advantage if you have the thin blade going through the body of an opponent effortlessly, like kind of a visceral, cue, basically dissuade your other opponents. So essentially it's a psychological warfare. But as you can see here, it inherits other traits of Type 18 blades, even though it's much, much broader than other examples, specifically reinforced tip. So even though it tapers down in thickness dramatically over here, to make the tip still durable, it swells up in thickness over here. So the tip is still reinforced, very thick. It's not very easy to break off. Yet, overall it's very thin, has a very long bevel, flat grind. Diamond cross section from the central ridge to the edge is just one flat surface. Very small edge angle. This has been used in competition cutting as a golden standard to win medals for very good reasons. Okay. However, it's not a perfect sword. As you can see, it has a very short reach comparing to many contemporary swords even. You can see here, this one here has 2 inches, 3 inches longer in blade length. It's quite a bit lighter, right? Half a pound lighter than this one, because look at not just the width of the blade, it's much smaller. Also, the hollow ground geometry on the blade makes it a lot nimbler and lighter. This one is no slouch, right? There's a reason that competition cutters just enjoy using this model at tournaments, because there are so many challenges designed around agility in advanced cutting tournaments. Right? Not just cutting through targets cleanly, but you have to do a lot of cut and thrust combos, double cuts, triple cuts combos, quick cuts. So with a blade designed to be this proficient in cutting, but has a mass distribution to make it very fast and responsive, this is just the pinnacle of cut-oriented sword. You can see here the true evolution of medieval swords from these earlier swords. Just make it longer, make it bigger, make it heavier, make it broader, right? And still very thin to be like a razor. And this one over here, after about, I wouldn't even say 2 centuries, like a century and a half, technology made the design of these swords evolve so much. Right? This, despite being very proficient in cutting, very thin, you can see, still quite rigid. So having a rigid blade is very conducive to good cutting and thrusting. So I would say this is much more advanced sword. Just for the cutting performance, right? Equal cutting performance, this is still more advanced than these earlier great swords of war. Now, by mid-15th century, many European cultures, civilizations had entered the Renaissance, right? The Restoration. Now there had been a boom of advancement in engineering and science, and we see that reflected in sword making as well. If we look at the design of this type 18B longsword, the Albion Regent, my favorite here. Contemporarily, you will see swords like this type 19 blade popping up at the same time, and they couldn't be further away from each other in terms of blade design. Look at the lack of profile taper on this one. And there I saw it. The advancement of sword making makes more of these blades with diamond cross section and a hollow ground blade, but also just a great degree of profile taper more popular, and which is, yes, indeed, it's the case. But we also see these new types of blade, specifically this Lockwood Irish longsword here features a type 19 longsword blade. You can see here, in contrast with these type 18 blades with a diamond cross section and a gentle degree of profile taper, resulting in a very acute point. This type 19 longsword over here doesn't have a lot of profile taper. So does this mean they are similar to the earlier swords of war? Yeah, in some sense they are. They feel similar, but this one here weighs only about 3/4 of the Albion Baron here. So what's going on here? If you examine the blade, you'll see at the base it has a ricasso. So just like the very flat area, very thick at the base. This adds additional mass to the base. So without increasing the width of the base, this brought back certain steel, certain material to the base. We know that the upper portion, when it has less steel compared to the base, the blade rotates more gracefully. Now, one way is to do the combination of distal taper and profile taper. Of course, this blade has a lot of distal taper, as we talk about later, but this technology of making a very thick ricasso also achieves that. And then we look at the cross section. These earlier great swords of war all have these lenticular cross section, right? A rounded shape on the edge bevel across the entire width of the blade. But these type 19 longswords, they have two prominent edges flanking the fuller on the lower half. But then it continues these facets, right, on the upper portion of the blade. So essentially they are hexagonal in cross section. There are 3 facets on each side of the blade, resulting in 6 facets altogether, hexagonal cross section. So like I talked about earlier, comparing to the diamond cross section, the 4-sided cross section, this brings additional steel. And also it makes the transition to the edge much shorter. So does this mean that with a shorter edge bevel, it has a bigger edge angle? Indeed it is, right? But we have to look at the rigidity of the blade. It's rather rigid because of this cross section, even though on this Lockwood Irish sword here, up here at the foible is a little bit above 2 millimeters. At the base is close to 7 millimeters. So this is still a very, very reasonable, very maneuverable sword, longsword. You can pull off lots of techniques. Even though with the Irish iconic ring pommel, it reduced so much mass. So this doesn't balance the blade as the same way as other European swords. See, the point of balance is relatively far from the hilt. Due to this ring pommel, does not add a lot of mass to the end of this lever. But still, even with this far point of balance, it's still light and nimble. You can pull off these double cuts very easily. Also, what it does is that it shifts the point of balance further away, make the sword very authoritative in cutting. It doesn't take a genius to figure out these blades are cutting oriented. It doesn't consider thrusting a lot. Even though we know that rigid blades are not bad at thrusting at all. And it essentially achieved the same performance in cutting, probably even more, with only 3/4 of the material as these earlier great swords of war. Essentially, an evolution of the war sword in the proportion of longsword. So we know that these cutting-oriented swords does not have a lot of technique behind it. It's not a very skill-oriented sword. You can pull off very fast cuts, right? But the focus is not precise jabbing, thrusting, winding. It's mostly just timely, cleaving, sweeping cuts. Goes to show the usage of these Irish greatswords in the hand of gallowglass mercenaries. They are a shock troop. They're to rush in as a disruptor against pikemen, arquebusiers, to cut them down and cause a lot of confusion, loss of morale, and basically a mercenary corps for the main troop of your employer to go in and finish the job. So the design of longswords, or basically any other sword, tells you the usage of them if you bother digging a little bit. Right? Now we see that the development of ricasso on the base of the blade as it approaches the end of the 15th century. We further see that on other type of swords. Oakeshott type 20A longsword here, you can also see here, has a very prominent ricasso at the base, basically identical to the type 19 longsword, the Lockwood Irish. This one here, the Albion Viceroy, has a different type of blade geometry than the Lockwood Irish sword with the hexagonal cross section here. This one is much broader, as you can see, and it still features a good degree of profile taper. Not as much as some of the type 18 or even type 15 long swords, but it's still, you can see here at the base, it doesn't taper much. And from midpoint on, it has a very gentle increased profile taper, resulting in a somewhat acute tip, not thrust oriented by any stretch of the imagination, but definitely more acute than these type 19 blades. Just put the gallowglass longsword down for a second, and you just handle this Albion Viceroy here. This one walks the line between just stout, like beefcake of a sword, and those nimble swords. It has a degree of nimbleness. It can pull off double cuts, triple cuts with ease, yet it has a feeling of very condensed, compact weight in the blade. This is not a very long blade, 35-inch long, and Oakeshott type 20A. It's not a very prolific type. You rarely see specimens as it approaches the end of the medieval times. Sees this geometry on some Renaissance longswords, right, with a ricasso at the base, transitions into a diamond cross section, like a proportion, with a noticeable amount of profile taper. So essentially, this is an alternative to the type 18 family of swords. This is one very popular example throughout late medieval times and Renaissance. You see here some similarity, but altogether this is a different school of thought in the sword making world. It just feels this is more graceful, more elegant, whereas the Albion Viceroy is very much still a war sword, a cutting sword. In recent years, there has been a trend of using the Albion Viceroy as the alternative in competition cutting to the Albion Principe and XIIIa. You can see here on the upper portion of the blade, it's pretty comparable, right? Like this is still rather wide, even though it has this taper. And yeah, this one over here weighs a little bit less, 5 ounces to be specific, than the Albion Principe. It feels somehow not as nimble as the Principe, yet lighter. So I can see how this is a healthy alternative, being so stylish in its appearance. You can see many of the visual elements popular at the beginning of the Renaissance being featured on this one. You can see a very unique type of fishtail pommel, different from previous ones. This one is very flat, but also has a very subtle hollow ground geometry in the facets of the pommel. And there's just so much going on this pommel. This one specifically is inspired by a longsword housed at the National Museum of Switzerland. And there are some other examples, but I think this is a very unique, very stunning look on a blade that's very different from other medieval swords. By this time, the end of the 15th century, we know that these swords essentially evolve into Renaissance swords. Soon we start seeing finger rings on the crossguard or on the side. You see side rings, and then there will be additional appendages for extra hand protection and for additional techniques. Because when you have a ricasso, right, very thick ricasso, it's very possible for you to loop your index finger across the guard, so you gain additional control over the blade, better for thrusting. And this is used a lot on rapier fencing techniques. Sometimes we even see two fingers above the crossguard. Of course, those have to be protected by a big cup hilt or swept hilt. These simple crossguards simply do not protect your fingers that much. And this essentially is the end of the evolution of medieval longswords, right before they transition into the complex hilt Renaissance swords. But also, your Oakeshott documented another type of unique sword that became increasingly popular at the beginning of the Renaissance, and that is Type 20 sword. And this happens to be a Type 20A sword. I don't have a specimen of Type 20 longsword, yet I have the Albion Maximilian here. And you will see, boy, this is a big one, all right? Big one and chunky one, comparing to any longsword. If I pick up my favorite longsword, the Albion Regent, you can see here. Yeah, the Albion Maximilian is 3 inches longer in the blade length, but has a much larger hilt, as you can see here. So this is what we call a true two-handed sword. Whereas long swords essentially can be seen as a hand-and-a-half sword. You can still use these with one hand, right? It's possible. You're on horseback, holding a rein, if you have to pick up a shield to defend against missile fires, projectiles, or you're grappling, you can still use this in one hand. It doesn't make a lot of sense using something as big as the Albion Maximilian. First of all, it weighs more than 5 pounds, so 60% than even the average weighted longsword over here. Many of these weigh just 3 pounds or under 3 pounds, so this can be twice as heavy, even though it's longer in blade, longer in the hilt, but it's not twice as big, right? And you see the silhouette of this Maximilian's blade is quite familiar, right? You pick up the earlier Grace of the War, this one over here, the Valiant Armoury Warden of the North, so 13A blade, you can see. Yeah, these are very similar, right? Not a lot of profile taper. There is some narrowing across the entire blade's length, but not a lot, right? Like less than 30%. And it's a similar degree of profile taper on this Maximilian Type 20 blade, but it's not entirely the same. If you look at the cross section, it has 2 soft ridges on side of these 2 fillers. So this is not a lenticular cross section, really. The Maximilian has a hexagonal cross section on the blade, resulting in more rigid, stronger blades, adding more steel to the blade, which explains why this is so heavy. But also, it has 2 fillers. Now, many of these Type 20 blades, they are characterized by multiple fillers. So some have 2, some have 3, some have even more. And we see this on many Renaissance swords, right? Most famously, Italian XVIIIa. They have 3, 5, or even like dozens of fillers. So the idea is to have fillers reduce weight on large part of the sword, but has many ridges as well. If you look at the ridges on this bifuller blade, you can see there are 3 ridges in the center, right? In the middle of the bifuller and flanking the fullers. So these ridges are the 6th part of the blade. They ensure the rigidity of the blade. If you look at the long blade on the Maximilian, 41-inch in blade length, and you think that it will be floppy, right? No, actually no, it's actually pretty rigid. Now, the longer the blade gets, the more difficult it is to make a rigid blade. Of course, one way is to make it super thick. When you have thick blades, of course, the material will ensure it's harder to flex or bend the blade. So the blade is very stable when you cut with it, has good cutting performance, but also thrusting performance. You can imagine if a sword, the blades is very flexible, easy to flex. When you jab into something, there's a resistance, and it will just flex and bend, rather than forcing its way through. So this technology is very prominent, very popular throughout the Renaissance. It's called fluting. Right? Essentially, just have grooves, number of grooves removing material, but has the ridges in between to ensure the rigidity. So you don't need as much material to ensure that degree of rigidity. Essentially reducing the weight somewhat for the purpose you want to achieve. And you see that on the hilt components as well. You see these risen geometry, and this happens to be very popular in the Holy Roman Empire regions, and they just love this risen geometry. And this is another kind of fluting. You can see there are grooves on the risen area, so essentially it's like reducing the weight. It's like fullers, right? But the thicker areas, it's like the ridges, they ensure the rigidity. So you don't need as much material as you would without fluting to maintain the same degree of rigidity and strength. And this Maximilian obviously is a very big sword. If you even consider it the longsword is a huge longsword, or you can just call it a two-handed sword. In German it's called Zweihänder, right? In modern days, Beidehänder. So this is the beginning of the popular Zweihänder, even though it still didn't feature the side rings, the parrying lugs, right? Additional hand protections. Later, some Swiss longswords made during the Renaissance had even additional knuckle bows, swept hilt to offer additional, even more hand protections. So it's just different directions for you to pad on additional protections. But be aware that when you do that, it definitely adds weight to the hilt. So it changes the handling a little bit. Even with this minimalist, just simple crossguard and the pommel, some people are not used to this kind of weight, how it moves. I reviewed this Maximilian in collaboration with Master Jensen in 2023. I enjoy the handling of this sword quite a bit, but I have to admit, it takes a lot of time to get used to it. But Jensen didn't really appreciate this too much. He likes the look of it, right? The risen hilt, everything, but he just didn't enjoy how it moves. In the hand of competent European martial art practitioners like Julien Schutze, you will be able to practice and adapt to the feeling, the handling characteristics of big swords like this Maximilian Type 20 blade. And essentially, yeah, you have to move alongside it. It's like a dancing partner. You have to accommodate its physical traits rather than having a natural extension of your arm. I have to say, such amount of weight, this is not bad even in one hand, but there's no denying that this feels half as heavy, not even half. I can keep the blade extended, right, this way all day. There's very little fatigue at all, whereas the Maximilian doesn't just have weight. The design of this blade just make it more akin to the earlier swords of war, and you have to wonder why it went back from thrust-oriented swords and balance between cut and thrust back into these more cutting-oriented swords, not just this Type 20 blade, but also Type 19, the Irish war sword. I think you can always look to history for clues. During the Renaissance, there are more centralized armies, sometimes mercenary bands formed by the sovereign themselves, like the Landsknecht by Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I. When you have a solid core of well-trained but experienced troops, you tend to make it cost-effective. If you look at the equipment of Landsknecht or other Swiss mercenaries, you'll see that they're not usually protected from head to toe with full plate armor. Now, there are some specialist troops wielding these two-handed swords, embedded in the midst of the pikemen and arquebusiers, but some other type of troops like the halberdiers. Those troops are not very well armored. They sometimes have breastplates, that's all, maybe a helmet, but not limb armor, limb protection. Right? They're not fully armored. They have very exposed limbs, hands, even legs. So target-rich environment for sure for these cutting-oriented swords. If you are the shock troops of those mercenary companies, whether to protect your own members, your own compatriots, or if you are a shock troop and rush into the enemy's rank to disrupt their pike formation, it's easier to find unprotected areas, unarmored areas to cut with these big swords, right? And there's so much more weight and so much length when you consider the reach of long swords or these edge weapons. The reach is not just how far away the tip is, it's everywhere from the tip to the base, right? Except for the ones with the short recoil. Every inch of edge area is where you can do damage, but also where you can parry your opponent's blow, parry their weapons, you have better coverage. But also, there's a potential of damaging pole weapons, such as halberds, pikes, spears, bills. When you can find opportunities to smash those pole weapons down to the ground, such a long leverage means that there's a great chance to damage the pole or haft of these weapons. And you don't necessarily break them in half right away, but they're damaged, like they're diminished. In a few strikes, they may eventually just snap. So there's a great advantage using these long-edged, cutting-oriented swords. You're not really fighting against fully armored man-at-arms regiments anymore. So the design of these swords perfectly reflects the evolution of European warfare and medieval arms and armor. We should also note that by the end of the 15th century, at the beginning of the Renaissance, many types of longswords coexisted outside the spectrum of the Oakeshott typology, such as some Irish and Scottish longswords and greatswords with a full lenticular cross-section without any fuller, or this very broad taper blade that's called Type 22 by your Oakeshott. They taper very little in the silhouette, despite being very broad overall and having very tiny short fullers at the base, very popular in Austria and northern Italy. And then there's another sub-variation of the Type 18. Type 18E, the so-called Danish longswords or Danish greatswords, usually featuring a slender blade that's tapered to acute point, but notably with a narrowed recoil at the base. You can see this example on the Albion Ringeck, or this fantasy longsword inspired by Type 18E, designed by CD Projekt Red for the video game Witcher 3, inspired by some of the Scottish and Irish hilt components, but with a recognizable Danish longsword blade type. This one made by Chris Fields of Sterling Armoury. From the second half of the 13th century, the fall of the Crusade states, and the decline of the Knights Templar Order, to the end of the 15th century, the conclusion of the Wars of the Roses, the beginning of the Renaissance, and the Italian Wars. We have gone through 250 years of evolution of longsword designs. We see that there's a very good variety for diverse purposes. You look at the evolution of medieval longswords, it reflects the advancement of not just armor making, but also European warfare. And even The late appearance of two-handed swords in European history tells you the swords were used always in pair with shields and bucklers. So the sudden popularization of two-handed grips, right, on these longswords tells you the transition, the sudden transition in the nature of the fight in Europe. And we now know there's such a big variety of longsword designs. Next up, I plan to do another video of the evolution of medieval arming swords, which is even a bigger topic because throughout human history, right, definitely European medieval times, one-handed swords, so-called arming swords, were the most stable, right? Everybody used these one-handed swords, whether as a sidearm when you operate bigger weapons, right, or war machines like trebuchets or cannons, or you're a rider on horseback, or you're holding a shield, or you're hiding behind pavis to reload your crossbow, or you're a pikeman holding polearms, halberdiers. You always have to carry some personal protection, and single-handed swords, right, is just the perfect answer to that. And of course, swords were a luxury to begin with in the history of Europe, but in the Middle Ages, it gradually became just a very affordable regular tools. Of course, very high status weapons were still made, very expensive ones. You can find a sword worth as much as a castle. But for ordinary troops, it's just a daily use tool, like an EDC. You carry it with you everywhere, and even not in war times, you bring them to a market for self-defense in case someone like thugs jumped you, or there's a dispute or anything. You use them for just personal protection or protection against home invasions. I hope you enjoyed this journey with me when we look at the evolution of medieval longswords. And if you have any questions, comments, leave in the comments below. And I have linked the review of each one of these longswords that I have reviewed. Of course, I still have quite a few to review in the future. The Albion Viceroy, Angus trim type 18A sword, Albion Baron, etc. The Lockwood hand and half swords. These are all phenomenal swords. So if you want to see the breakdown of each one of these, stay tuned. Meanwhile, when I talk about these swords, I no longer have to compare each of them individually. I can refer to this video. If you enjoy this video, this journey with me, find any value or entertainment, please like and subscribe.